what are you working on now? Like the depth and the height part. Can you explain that?
Yeah.
'Cause I somewhat understand it, but I need more clarity on
With
it.
quadrants specifically.
Yeah, with the
Yeah.
quadrants.
Actually, I'm gonna send you guys this after. I put together like a presentation that I think will be
Mm.
helpful for the stuff that we're gonna do in the future. To kind of understand it a little bit, I put together like 28 slides that I'm gonna send you guys that kind of lays this all out. But to try to keep it as clear as possible. So really, I was thinking about the ways to create this spectrum that a lot of people talk about from like elastic to muscular perspective. And I've looked so much into counter movement depth as a metric. And it seems like it's like
Yep.
the redheaded stepchild of like force plate metrics because everybody wants to talk about like breaking RFD and relative peak propulsive power and the strategy metric of counter movement depth I think just tells you so much if the cueing and constraints you put around the movement, in this terms of CMJ on a force plate, is in a way that an athlete expresses what they naturally want to express. Like they're
Right.
innate. And what I mean by that is I think that like on a vertec, the only goal is to jump as high as humanly possible.
Yeah.
So athletes are going to change their strategy to achieve that outcome. Now, on a force plate, athletes are still trying to jump as high as possible. I tell them to jump fast and high to uh, I'm trying to think of I use basketball examples. Like the person I always think about is Al Horford. Fast and high to Al Horford is going to look a lot different than fast and high to John Morant.
Right.
So now they're going to self select what depth at which they want to move through to accomplish the task of jumping fast and high. Now, if we think about what happens at different depths of movement in a CMJ, if you move through a huge depth of counter movement, it's probably because you want to spend a little bit more time on the ground, create a little bit more impulse. And as we get into deeper ranges of motion, we're probably leveraging musculature. We
Right.
probably want to harness the power of like big movers of the lower body. Now, if we think the opposite end of that spectrum and we think of a very shallow counter movement depth, can you guys hear a shit ton of feet like background in mine? My daughters are going crazy.
Yeah, it's all good.
Okay. Um, so you think of the opposite, shallow counter movement. It's probably because that athlete doesn't want or doesn't need to leverage those big musculature that the deep counter movement is going to give them, and they really just want to create a really rapid stretch of connective tissue and use it to get off the ground really fast.
Mm.
So I think you guys hear that? My daughters are freaking nuts.
It's all good.
So give me 1 second.
Oh yeah.
My mom's here babysitting him right now, so I just texted him. Hopefully she'll quiet him down.
I wish. I
Uh,
wish my. I wish I had that.
yeah, it's clutch. She's here for a week, and it makes my life so much
Yeah.
easier. Okay, so like that's the x axis of the quadrants. It goes from shallow counter movement depth to deep counter movement depth. Okay, now the y, I've messed around with looking at like modified reactive strength on the y, and I've talked to a couple people like Drake at Hawken and different people that really understand metrics and plates really well. And what I didn't like about using modified reactive strength in version one of this is that modified reactive strength is kind of skewed toward time to take off. If you have a really fast time to take off and like a very average to below
Right.
average jump height, your modified reactive strength is going to be really good compared to the guy that has a solid time to take off and a really high jump height. His modified reactive strength isn't going to be as good. And that to me kind of like skews data and it pulls it to the top left, shallow counter movement and high modified reactive strength, which I didn't like.
Mm.
So then I was like, okay, let's just look at jump height. Like you can look at counter movement depth and jump height. Now that might skew things to the top right because guys that spend a little bit more time on the ground are probably going to end up jumping a little bit higher. But what I saw whenever I did that is that it didn't. There was still, honestly, a majority of the guys in the top two quadrants in that top left quadrant. So shallow counter movement depth, high jump height. So I was like, okay.
Mm.
And the distribution of the data just looked a lot cleaner. It wasn't pooled, which I appreciated because I know the range of movers that I've had over the last 3 years when I did this. Now, the last piece I added to this, and you can do all that, what I just talked about, like on Hawkins quadrant charts that they have, which is high level. You can pick any metrics you want, boom, boom, X, Y. But then I was thinking is like a layer to this. I still wanted to include some sort of modified reactive strength because if you're just looking at jump height and only quantifying it that way, well, then you don't think about like, okay, how long is it actually taking them to move through that range of motion and achieve that jump height? So then
Yeah.
using it'd be cool if I could code all this, but I definitely can't. I used AI, created another graph that included time to takeoff based on the size of the dot. So now X counter movement depth, Y jump height, size of dot relative to time to take off. The bigger the dot, the faster the time to take off. The smaller the dot, the slower the time to take off. So that just adds a whole nother
Do you
element.
feel like,
Go ahead.
sorry to interrupt,
No, you're
do you
good.
feel like the time to take off is correlated with the counter movement depth
Yeah.
at all?
Yeah, it is
Yeah.
for sure. But what's really helpful is now whenever we start talking about movement, left, right, up, down, now I can look and I can think, okay, if because you got, and I'll just say this just so I can begin to speak in the names because it's easier. Top right uh, would be high jump height, deep counter movement depth. That is what I call cannons. Shift over one, high jump height, shallow counter movement depth is what I call whips. Bottom left, small jump height, small counter movement depth is what I call rubber bands. And then bottom right, deep counter movement depth, low jump height is what I call anchors. Okay, so now if you're working in the top two quadrants and you have a whip or a cannon and you're trying to optimize them, they already jump really high and they've already probably settled into a strategy that's best for them. And you look at somebody maybe as a cannon in top right, and they're very vertical, maybe the most vertical athlete on your chart, but they have a tiny little dot. It's because they're relying on jump height. So the thing that you could potentially give them to enhance their qualities to make them even better, like if a guy in my world is jumping 60 hands on hips, 60 centimeters hands on hips on the plates, like, okay, jump height is not what I need to add to that individual.
Mm-hmm.
But if he's getting off the ground slow as hell to do it and moving through, I don't know, 45 centimeters of counter movement depth, okay, the thing I can give that individual is time to take off. And I realize that now with the size of the dot and the horizontal placement on the quadrants. And to the question you just asked, like, yeah, there is correlation there. Guys on the right side are probably going to have smaller dots than the guys on the left side, but you can look at the extremes. And an example I just gave, like, okay, that guy's a tiny dot. He's way far on the right. Let's try to move him left and try to keep him vertical. Because then I'm maybe just shortening up his counter movement depth a little bit. I'm getting him off the ground faster, and he's still jumping 58 centimeters. Cool, that's a win for me. You know what I mean?
Do you find any like injury or soreness patterns that are unique to their quadrants, like kind of like how we do James Wilds and all that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I haven't been able to dig into that one with my data specifically, but something that so I since we started talking, I've like looked into the James Wild quadrants more than like I ever have in my life. I just listened to him on Just Fly yesterday when we were coming back from Houston just to like understand
Mm-hmm.
it better. And I've texted you guys an annoying amount about like different things about it. Um, and just like looking at what he's laid out, I don't think the quadrants overlay perfectly one to one. Like I don't think you can just put the archetype quadrants on top of his because of what I said earlier. I feel like his is
Definitely not.
strategy based 100%. Mine is output and strategy based. But I do think there is slight correlation. And me and Danny talked about this. And his quadrants, unless you can confirm or deny this, that are probably going to have the most elastic athletes would be bounders and bouncers. Do you agree or disagree?
For sure.
Okay, so if you overlay these quadrants, James Wild and the archetype, the bounder and bouncer are his top left, bottom left. My top left, bottom left are whips and rubber bands. Now, I think spinners gets a little bit different compared to anchors. Like I don't think that lines up. Cannons, I think, can line up a little bit. But when I look at James Wild quadrants, and you guys know it a lot better than I do, but you can confirm or deny this as well. If we move from drivers to spinners to bouncers to bounders, so we just kind of make a circle around them, it kind of goes from proximal to distal from an injury pattern perspective.
Hmm.
So when I'm thinking about mine, that injury pattern makes sense as well. Because if I'm working with, well, I just zoomed in. So AI camera, watch this. Make a little.
What in the alien?
It's supposed to zoom out, but now it's not working. There we go.
I would pay $3,000 to see Danny do that.
Now I'm just gonna be zoomed in on my face the whole time.
That's a really interesting point, though.
Yeah. So like, if you think about the quadrants that I have, and if you move in that same sequence, you go from cannons to anchors to rubber bands to whips. In my head, now I can't proof this with the data I have yet, but if you move in that same sequence in mine, I think it makes sense to move from proximal to distal. Like you're moving from your explosive deep counter movements. Now the anchors is the one that gets a little bit fuzzy because that's still deep counter movement, but it's poor jump height. So these are just like your bad, more muscular driven movers. But then you move to your rubber bands, who are your not as potent, as impressive elastic movers. And then you move to like your elastic best movers. And to me, that proximal to distal injury sequence kind of makes sense. So it's something I began thinking about because, again, the quadrants don't overlay perfectly, but I do think that there's some correlation. So if I were to answer this question right now without having proof, I would say that I think about it from like a proximal distal distribution.
Mm.
Les, can I jump in on that real quick?
Yeah.
So, kind of a two-part question here, but the first part of this is, what's the goal? And I'll give context by saying, like, the keeping the comparison here, the James Wild quadrants are, in my mind, more interpretive, where we're looking at spatiotemporal qualities, we're looking at strategy based, differences in movements, to just give deeper descriptions of how athletes are effectively doing the same tasks, right? In the combine, it's pretty simple. Got 25, 30 guys. All of them do it uniquely or differently or with an individual strategy, but they're doing the exact same task. So the outcome of those for me, especially on the health side, is having a deeper analysis of where we may see vulnerability as we go through this training process. But with yours, it's a little bit different. So again, I reiterate, like, is this to help with programming decisions? Is this to help, convey information to staff? Is this to, just have a better proxy on the individual archetypes within your group? Like, what is the utility of this for you?
Great question, and obviously the most important thing. It's cool to make a quadrant chart, but like, how the hell are you going to use it? This is it to me. So you have this spectrum of athletes. You have elastic movers, you have muscular movers, and I think that like whether people want to say that's like voodoo science or not, like there's archetypes of athletes.
Hundred percent.
You look at I don't know, the football example I like to use, because obviously if you talk about offensive linemen to receivers, you can point that out easily. But even in the same position group, you look at like Xavier Worthy and AJ Brown. It's like those dudes are
Right.
so incredibly different. Now,
Yeah.
to relate it to my quadrants, I think AJ Brown is probably a cannon, and Xavier Worthy at this point in his career is probably a rubber band. He's a very fast rubber band, but he's probably a rubber band. Okay, so now, and I'll use this as an example to my population because I actually have data on them. Is I create my quadrant chart and I look and I think, does the quadrant that this person represent in right now makes sense. And the way that I like proof makes sense is I think about the structure of that athlete and then the quadrant that they represent in. Now I'll give you an example. I have a kid on this year's team who is 6'8", 230, the epitome of a muscular driven mover. He doesn't really love the weight room, but that's a whole nother story. But like, if you were to measure his ISA, probably 110 plus for sure. Like, I like to look at like the lower leg structure, calf to Achilles. Like elastic movers are probably gonna have a really long Achilles, short muscle bellies. Opposite for muscular, he has long calf, short, like just the epitome of a muscular driven mover. And he's a rubber band. He's almost as far left. He's the furthest left dot on the initial assessment. And I think, and he's low. Obviously, he's in that third rubber band quadrant. And I think to myself, that is not an optimal movement strategy that he's choosing for himself. Now, if I were to just look at him and think, okay, all I were to say were like, let's look at your jump height, or let's look at some other metrics, and I didn't necessarily plot it, and I didn't have the comparative power of like a quadrant chart, I would say like, okay, he doesn't jump very high, let's have him jump higher. And I would dose him with things to make him hopefully jump higher. But he is self-selecting a strategy of 26 centimeter counter movement depth that is never going to be productive for him. Now you take it a step further and I add a layer to this whole equation. And this person who had bilateral patellar tendonitis injections a year ago. So then you add the layer of injury history and you're like, okay, this individual is self-selecting a movement strategy here in a very like controlled environment of a CMJ on a force plate that is not optimal for his structure. And the structure piece is huge to this whole thing. Now, why? Because of his injury history. Okay, so now what can I give this athlete to shift him right? Because people could argue like, well, you want him to have a short counter movement depth. You want him to get off the ground super fast. Like, yeah, that is a goal, but everybody's going to have an optimal strategy. And his optimal strategy, in my opinion, is leveraging bigger musculature. And at 26 centimeters of counter movement depth, you're not doing that. So I need to expose him to things, some high force loading, some slow force loading for the tissue that's been so damaged in the past, some deep tier plyometrics to remove the inhibition from his previous injury and get him moving into a bigger counter movement depth to leverage the tissue that he innately is going to be better at leveraging to then move him vertical.